Good morning, everyone, and welcome. This is Dun Bradstreet's webinar, How Do CCPA and GDPR Impact B2B Marketers? My name is Maggie Granger, and I will be hosting and moderating for you today. The webinar is scheduled to run for 45 minutes, and then at the end, we will have time for a Q&A. So with that, we will go ahead and jump in. A few housekeeping items. All of the phone lines will remain muted throughout today's call. You can submit questions in the Q&A box on the right side of your display panel. And you will receive a follow-up email in the next few days with today's presentation slides, as well as a copy of our PDF, 5 questions to ask your B2B data provider. So on the agenda today, we are going to jump into a background on CCPA, GDPR, and what you need to know as a marketer. Julian Archer from Forrester is a guest speaker and is going to walk through some examples of how others have strategically planned for new data compliancy regulations. We will then dive into review specific impacts for demand gen and marketing operations professionals, and then wrap it up with going over challenges and solutions for unifying and maintaining your contact data. And then at the very end, we will have a Q&A. Our presenters today, which I'm very happy to introduce, are going to be, again, Julian Archer from Forrester as our guest speaker. Julian is a VP Principal Analyst from Forrester that specializes in data management priorities and helping his clients understand strategies and how to adapt to increased data privacy regulations like CASL, CCPA, and GDPR. We also have Julia Durbin. She is our Senior Privacy and Compliance Attorney at Dun Bradstreet. Julia is the legal lead for Dun Bradstreet's CCPA compliance program and is a certified information privacy professional in the United States and the European Union. Last but very not least, we also have Deniz Olcay, our Director of Product Marketing at Dun Bradstreet. Deniz is a passionate MarTech thought leader and really is a specialist on helping organizations use data to fuel their growth strategies. So without further ado, I will pass over to Deniz.
Thank you, Maggie, and welcome, everyone. I wanted to start out the webinar today by just giving some context as to what got us to where we are today. The rise of data privacy regulations is really no accident. It's really a direct cause of the misuse of personal data. The rise of internet and the digital age gave us all access to a lot of information, but it also made our personal data much more vulnerable, right? We then saw the rise of email and marketing automation as an engagement channel and saw more and more spam, and I think that this really frustrated the buying community and consumers, and most recently, we're seeing an increase of data breaches and hacks. Ultimately, this is resulting in a loss of trust. While data has been and will always really be integral to growth, we must really regain trust with our prospective buyers. And I wanted to share this visual, and I stumbled upon this when I was browsing the web, and I thought it was quite striking. It visualizes all the prominent data breaches over the past few years or so. So at the top line, you'll see all the data breaches that have happened in 2019, and sort of in the middle 2018, and at the bottom 2017. And the relative size of the bubbles shows the size of the data breach. So you'll see Facebook with 420 million or so records impacted, sort of most prominently at the top over there. And each bubble is actually clickable to a deeper dive story. So if you have time after the webinar, I'd recommend taking a look at it. It's quite interesting. The bottom line is that buyers are more concerned about their data and privacy than they have been ever before. And I think this creates both a challenge for us as marketing and sales teams, but I think there's also an opportunity here. So we'll cover a little bit about that and how you can use this to your advantage and better engage your customers and your prospects. So should you be thinking about these regulations and their impact on your organization? Our answer is an emphatic yes. Hopefully you agree as well. You have the potential to open up your company to reputational and financial risk if you're not considering these today. My advice would be take a look at how your competitors are reacting to this, right? There could be a potential for you to use this to your advantage and establish trust with your buyers and get ahead of the curve and engage them in a way that respects their privacy while also delivering them value. And you really don't have to boil the ocean here. There are simple steps you can take to achieve compliance. We'll cover some of those today. We have some great speakers that are experts in this subject, and we will share with you some actionable advice that you can take away after this webinar. Overall, according to a survey done by eMarketer, which you'll see on the right, 30% or so organizations in the U.S. are compliant with CCPA, with around 27% planning to be compliant this year. There are about 12 to 13% that are still waiting until after 2020, and I think about 12% have no plans to be compliant at all. So we really believe part of the issue here is getting a clear understanding of the regulation and knowing what steps to take to achieve compliance. Hopefully by the end of this webinar, you'll feel more confident to tackle this issue. With that, we figured it would be interesting to do a poll of all of you in the audience today and see how you compare, right? So you should see a poll launching on your screen momentarily. So we'll give folks just a moment here to fill in the poll, and then we'll share the results and see how it compares with what you're seeing on your screen today. Just a couple more moments here. Have people fill it in. Early numbers are looking, much higher actually. So thank you everyone for filling that in. It seems like almost 60% of you are currently compliant with CCPA, which is great news. And about 26% or so will be compliant with CCPA sometime in 2020, and 11% will be compliant sometime after 2020. So a good distribution. Certainly seems like the folks on the call are a bit more ahead of the curve, which is great news. So with that, I'll pass it on to Julia Durbin, our senior privacy attorney here at Dun Bradstreet, to just give us a brief overview of CCPA, GDPR, the differences, and where the regulatory landscape is going. Julia?
Thanks, Deniz. So I just wanted to talk briefly about emerging trends in privacy regulation. As you can see from this slide, there's quite a few proposed legislation that could be going into effect in the near future. We have here a list of states in the United States, but there are also global trends. Overall trend is very much in the direction of additional privacy regulation in the United States and around the world. I know we also have the India privacy law. We have one in Brazil, Thailand, and many more locations as well at various stages. So, I think you can look at this as a potential threat, or you can look at it as a potential opportunity to give your company an advantage in the, competitive marketing area. And I think it's great seeing the results of the poll, because it sounds like the people that we have attending here belong to companies that really take the approach of viewing this as a competitive advantage and trying to leverage a lot of these emerging legislation to really build up their privacy program, give their customers confidence that this is something that they are, on the cutting edge of, that this is something that they're keeping up with, and that they are a trustworthy partner in the marketing area. So I wanted to also dive in a little bit deeper on the CCPA. The liability for violating the CCPA is up to $7,500 for each intentional violation. The floor is $2,500, so even the floor is quite high. The liability for breach of sensitive information belonging to a California resident is $100 to $750 per consumer record. One interesting thing about that is that there's no requirement to prove damages, so that if a consumer's personal sensitive information has been subject to unauthorized access, there is liability that attaches whether the consumer has been damaged or not. Now, the term sensitive is interesting here because it's not any personal information, right? Just because someone's email has been subject to unauthorized access doesn't mean that there's $100 damages plus. But it is data such as social security numbers, credit card numbers, passwords, and information that would give someone access to another person's online account. This is the type of data that is considered sensitive. I know for us at Dun Bradstreet, we have a data classification policy, and one of the interesting things for us was that when we saw the list of sensitive data elements under the CCPA, it was what we already considered sensitive information, which is why I think that data classification policy is very helpful
It's very important to understand that separation between personal information, which is certainly still confidential and certainly should still have safeguards, but also sensitive information, which, is something that has to be treated with added caution. So I wanted to, in a single slide, try to give you guys as much of an overview of the CCPA as I possibly can within a limited period of time. So I know that there's a lot here, and my goal is to give everyone just a kind of high-level overview of what the program is, although I know that given the kind of audience that we have here, this may be something that you're already quite familiar with, which is fantastic. So the CCPA went into effect on January 1st, 2020. Enforcement begins on July 1st, 2020. However, there is a look-back function. So the California Attorney General will be looking back to what you have had in place on January 1st, 2020. The CCPA covers any business with any of the following: revenue of $25 million or more, a business that buys or sells or uses personal information of 50,000 or more consumers. And remember, it's interesting, the statute does not specify California consumers. So if you buy or sell or use personal information of 50,000 plus consumers, you could be covered by the CCPA. And the third criteria, and again, it's or, the third criteria is primary revenue source is the sale of personal information. So any business that meets any three of these criteria would be covered by the CCPA. So if you are covered, some of the things that you need to know is that you have to give notice when collecting personal information. Sometimes that can be satisfied by just linking to your privacy notice, or some businesses select to have more targeted notices that specifically identify the type of information that you're collecting and the type of use cases to which you will put that information. You have to honor the CCPA rights. And the CCPA consumer rights are the right to know and access, the right to deletion, the right to opt out, and the right not to be discriminated against. And, one thing I just wanted to mention about these rights, to me, these rights are kind of reflected by the golden rule, which is that do unto others what you would want done unto yourself. I think that this really represents and is intended to represent the sorts of things that we all want, right? So we all want to know when our data is being collected. We all want to be able to find out what kinds of data has been collected about us. We want to have control over our data, and so if we decide that we no longer want it out there, we all want to be able to delete it. We all want to have control over whether our personal data is sold. And if we do exercise our rights, we don't want to be discriminated against or mistreated because, we chose to do so. And I think that's really kind of the essence of the CCPA rights. I know a lot of companies, Dun Bradstreet, for example, has the rights on our privacy notice. So if you want to exercise your CCPA rights through Dun Bradstreet, you can go to our privacy notice. There's a form that you can fill out, and you can exercise your right to know and access, deletion, and opt out. Vendor compliance is another big part of the CCPA program. And I think it's a little bit unusual based on what some of the other privacy legislation requirements have been. Vendor compliance is a big part of the CCPA because they do have that requirement that any vendor from whom you obtain personal information has to be CCPA compliant. I also just wanted to touch briefly upon definitions because, again, I think under the CCPA we're looking something that we are not fully accustomed to based on our experience with past privacy legislation. So, for example, consumer is any resident of California. That is very similar to what we've seen under the GDPR, although I think sometimes the word consumer throws people off because it sounds like consumer is narrower than it is. I mean, in this instance, consumer just means person. It's any person that resides in California, and I have seen some confusion around that. Personal data is any data that can be quote-unquote associated with a single individual or household. The sale of data is any data exchanged for benefit. And again, what we're seeing over and over again with the CCPA is the definitions are very broad. And I think that the ultimate example of that is publicly available information, which is actually very narrow, but I think it's broad from the perspective of your privacy interests. And publicly available information is limited to information made publicly available by the government. And that's very narrow. And I think that in many ways that's not what we expect when we see the term publicly available information, because when you hear publicly available information, you think, oh, it's things I find on Google. And under this definition, things that you find on Google are not publicly available information. And remember, the reason why publicly available information is important under the CCPA is that it is outside the scope of the law. So all of these requirements about vendor compliance and CCPA rights, they are not applicable to publicly available information, but publicly available information means from government sources that are publicly available. So I know that was a lot, but again, I tried to fit everything I could about the CCPA on a single slide, and I hope I hit like all the really big high points. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the myths that are floating around the CCPA and see if we can provide a little bit of additional clarity. So one myth that I hear a lot is I have to stop marketing to California companies. That's not true, and I think that very few have taken that approach. I think most of us have taken the approach of we can be compliant. It's not the end of the world. The sky is not falling down. We are continuing to market to California companies. And remember, there is no opt-in requirement under the CCPA. There is a notice requirement, which is a little bit different. I think that sometimes people get confused about the two because both have to be provided at the point when information is collected. But notice just means that you have to inform people, right? A lot of companies just utilize a link to the privacy notice to satisfy the notice requirement. Whereas under the GDPR, there is an opt-in requirement. And opt-in means that you need an affirmative act from the data subject where they have to click on something and actually say, yes, I do agree. That requirement is not there under the CCPA. Another myth is that if you are GDPR compliant, you're all set with the CCPA. It's not necessarily true that one is more difficult to, satisfy than the other. They're just different. And if you have all of your GDPR requirements in place, it doesn't mean that you've also satisfied all of the CCPA requirements. I mean, it's a great start, and I think that the GDPR program can really be heavily leveraged for CCPA compliance, and I know that's something that we've done at Dun Bradstreet. But there are additional things that you will have to put in place that are CCPA specific. So another one is we don't collect consumer data, so we don't need to worry about the CCPA. And I know I mentioned this before. I think there's some confusion around this concept of what the CCPA means when I say consumer data. Consumer data under the CCPA just means personal information, and so of any individual. It's not, an individual acting as a consumer. It's just any personal information of an individual. So if you are collecting personal information, you are quite possibly covered and within the scope of the CCP. So I also wanted to talk briefly, because again, I know so many companies are leveraging their GDPR program for their CCPA compliance. And I wanted to talk briefly about kind of the similarities and differences between the two. So beginning with the definition of personal data, which I really think is key. Under the CCPA, any data that can be associated with an individual or household is personal information. And it is based on residency, just like under the GDPR. So under the GDPR, any data related to an identified or identifiable natural person is personal information. And I think when you look at those two definitions, a lot of people might say, oh, you made a mistake. Move that similar tag up to the top here. But I don't think that that would be correct, because what we have found is that the CCPA definition of personal information is broader. And if you look at that, for example, household word, that is broader than what we see under the GDPR. And also the fact that they use the term associated with is broader. And, you know, in some instances it may not make any difference, but we have found is if you have had as part of your compliance program a situation where you've been on the fence about whether certain types of data collection and certain types of aggregated data are personal information or not, there could be instances where under the GDPR you made a decision that it was not personal information. You know, maybe it's data on several individuals in a single household. And under the CCPA, it is. So keep that in mind, and don't over-rely on decisions that you made based on the GDPR definition of personal information. So opt-ins, a little bit of CCPA good news here. Opt-ins are not required by default under the CCPA. There are certain exceptions for children's data, and you know, there are requirements where someone who has already made an opt-out request, you should not be collecting information on that individual unless they have opted back in. But other than that, as a general matter, there's no opt-in requirement. There's just a consent requirement. Under the GDPR, by default, opt-in is required. There are certain exceptions, such as the legitimate business interest, but you kind of go in with an assumption that opt-in consent is required unless you can identify legitimate business interest why you're not collecting consent. So cross-border transfers, another little bit of good news with the CCPA. There is no special requirements for cross-border transfers. I think, as we all know, with the GDPR, there are quite stringent requirements, such as contractual clauses, opt-in consent if you're taking data into the United States. Privacy Shield is another option. But there has to be something in place if you're taking EU resident data outside of the EU to a jurisdiction that is not considered adequate under the GDPR. Vendors is another interesting one, and I think that there are both similarities and differences here. Both the GDPR and the CCPA have requirements around vendors, but I think they take something of a different approach. The CCPA really looks at vendors who are data providers, right? So if you have a vendor that is giving you personal information, you have a responsibility to ensure that your vendor is CCPA compliant. And I think that's a little bit different from the GDPR, although both have vendor requirements. Remember, the GDPR vendor requirements are really around third-party processors. And processors are third parties that act on the orders of the controller, right? So they're just fulfilling the instructions of the controller. Honoring data subject requests. And I think here, again, I wanted to mention just this idea of having control over your own data and the sorts of things that we all want. I think that both the GDPR and the CCPA try to put something in place that really is all about consumer demand and the kind of control that consumers want over their data. And they might call them different things, but in the end, it's all about controlling, you know, what data companies have that belongs to you, and then being able to access and know what data they have. All right, and now I wanted to hand it off to Julian Archer for his perspective.
Thank you very much indeed, Julia. And it's great to speak to everybody today. Now, we heard some great input and some great advice there from Julia about the law, what the law is. But the majority of folks on the phone today are tasked in marketing, in sales, to actually continue to drive business. We still have to make sure people come and buy from us so we can actually feed our families. And what I'm showing you here is a Serious Decisions data privacy compliance model, which is actually a framework which lets us in sales and marketing get our arms around this massive elephant that is data privacy laws. we need to understand what the impact of these laws are in the way we go about our marketing and sales business. So I want to run through this model with you very, very quickly, but also show you two examples of organizations to have done exactly what Julia said. Look at the positive side. Look at the way that the data privacy laws are actually acting as a catalyst to drive better business. So rather than looking at the doom and gloom, oh my goodness, the fines, think about what they can do to improve your relationship, your relevance, your focus with your prospects and your customers. So this model at the top, it actually says, first of all, what is it at your corporate data, at your corporate level, what is your corporate data strategy? You've seen even from the survey that we took earlier on today that not everybody is compliant. Some people don't intend to be compliant. There's a whole range of potential avenues that you can follow. So what is the legal advice you've been given? What is your risk profile as a company? That has to be designated and defined. Look at the bottom. The people, all your staff and training, they need to be trained, for example, for new processes. They need to understand what the privacy laws are, but also what change of process they have to enact to make sure they are using compliant data. What technology are you using? Are you going to be looking at consent systems and data tracking systems and requests, etc., and looking at preference centers? Understand what technology implications you have as an organization as a result of these data privacy laws. And it's always very well saying, are we compliant, are we not compliant? You need to start measuring this. Look at your size of your database. What proportion of your database is actually compliant? What's not compliant? So start measuring your level of compliance. But it's those 5 boxes in the middle that are really important. They'll look at really the data life cycle. Because as an organization, it's important that you fully understand where and how and from where that data is coming into your systems and into which systems is it coming. So I'll come on to that into more detail in a minute, but it's important that we take the opportunity to really look and say, all this data coming in, do we need it? Where's it coming from? Because these laws are not business prevention regulations. They are actually aimed at making us better marketers, better salespeople, treating the data with respect. So once the data's come in, how are we storing it? Where are we storing it? You just heard Julia say that if you're taking data from outside the EU or the EEA, then you need to have some regulations in place or some processes in place to make sure it's all compliant. And you may think, well, don't worry, I'm in marketing or I'm in sales. I don't worry about that because I've got an IT department that does that for me. Well, actually, if you are in marketing and you're using an event management system, or you're in sales, for example, and using LinkedIn and you're bringing data into your system, then all of a sudden you become the data controller. So you have to think about how you're storing that data. Think also about your teams, your salespeople, your marketing people, and how are they going to be ensured that they use compliant data? How will you make sure that they use compliant data? So the whole area of data usage of this compliant data is really important as well. Data maintenance. Gone are the days where you can take a piece of data and say, that's mine forever and a day. You need to make sure that you're tracking if somebody opted out. If they've already given you consent, have they withdrawn that consent? Have they said, I want my data to be deleted, for example? In many laws around the globe, for example, Castle, the period by which you can say someone's a customer will end after 24 months. So you need to think about that actually that maintenance needs to be considered and thought through and have a process for ensuring the maintenance of the lawful basis for which you hold and process that data. And that one on the end is quite interesting, isn't it? How many of you actually have a data disposal policy or a data retention policy? Think about the amount of data you have and think how often do you go through and actually physically delete the data. I don't mean archive it and put it in a special place somewhere. I mean actually delete it. So this model helps us get our arms around all the processes that we need to review, analyze, and update with a view to being compliant. Now, rather than me just talking about theoretical things, I want to really go into 2 examples of 2 companies that have used this model and just pick out a few things which are actually showing how they are becoming better as marketers. First of all, let me pick on the San Francisco company New Relic, $500 million company. I'm really intrigued of how they've gone about reviewing the data intake process that they had, understanding where the data came from, and also how they began to train their staff and their people, both marketing and sales. So let's just dig deeper a little here. What I'm showing you now is you don't need to look at every single box there, But this is actually a port of entry analysis that New Relic undertook. As a result of the data privacy laws, they knew that they needed to know where's this data coming from and what type of quality and how compliant is that data. I draw your attention to all the various sources, websites, events, emails, websites, etc. But also think about, they have channel partners, they have salespeople bringing data in, they even have personal data in their product as well. So all these sources of data need to be tracked. And then they could then look at where these sources of data are coming from and understand the relative compliance or non-compliance of that data. So they also found that this was a great way to look at, from a purely improved marketing and sales perspective, hey, this source of data is giving us some really good quality leads. We should be looking at improving or enhancing or multiplying this type of activity we're doing to get more data. So they can see it's actually a benefit to them to fully understand why and how this data is coming in. They were able to offer clear guidelines to all the folks who were getting the data of what to do or what not to do. Importantly, it wasn't just marketing, it was sales and product as well. Across the whole spectrum of the revenue engine, they were able to make sure that everybody understood their role in being compliant. Now I say that, think about how often have you been told, well, all these privacy laws, that's only a marketing function. I'm in sales, that doesn't affect me. I'm sorry, it does affect you. And what New Relic set about was training their staff. They actually introduced job aids to help the sales folks understand what they could do in terms of outreach and what sources of data they could use for data enrichment. They did a simple green, amber, and red. If it was green, then hey guys, no problem, carry on doing what you're doing. If it was red, you cannot do this, absolutely not, we will be fined, you have to stop doing this practice. But as I said, all privacy laws, there's a level of interpretation, and someone's legal counsel may be different than somebody else's. And so the orange ones, or the amber ones, were more around the idea of, hey, let's discuss this, let's see what we can do, we need to tweak something? The point being, as part of their training, they made sure sales were not left in the dark and a free-for-all. They gave them advice and guidance of what could and could not be done. Now, overall, the success that New Relic had was they looked at the intake. They were absolutely validating 90-plus data sources. They could see what data was good and what data was bad. The marketing operations team thought as though we need to review our processes. We need to enhance our processes. They actually introduced 14 new processes. They actually invented or they developed new event templates to capture contact details at an event. Funnily, and this has nothing to do with privacy, they also recognized the importance of looking at their data and the recency of their data. Prior to this whole training exercise, they had been getting large, disturbing telephone calls from their MAP provider saying, you've reached your data limit, you need to give us more money. But as a result of this exercise, looking at the data coming into the systems, looking at what data is good and valid and compliant, and what data, quite frankly, is just rubbish, they were actually able to delete a lot of their old rubbishy data. And that MAP requirement to increase their subscription disappeared. So it's actually a cost saving. Now, was that as a result? That's not because GDPR or CCPA is telling you have to do it. It's just plain business sense. It's acting as a catalyst to force you to be better marketers and better salespeople. Sales operations were also involved, and they did some field mapping to make sure that they could be compliant with their data. They looked at sales as part of a collaborative process. The idea of managing data is not just some poor marketing operations person's job on a Sunday morning. It's about a process, and that's what they recognized. They did an awful lot of training. 60-odd sales development reps, 260 people there. You can see all the list of people that were trained there. It was a massive element, a massive program, but with the importance of saying, this is something good for our business. Can we improve our processes, improve our focus and relevancy to our prospects and marketing? So that's New Relic. Let's look at a different size organization and think about a small organization called 3M. Yes, it's a large, massive US multinational. And I want to look here at what they did in terms of their corporate strategy. How did they view, in this case it was GDPR, but they're also looking at CCPA as well. How do they view data privacy laws? I'll also look at some of the data intake from a sales perspective and how they're using and how they're measuring data as well. So from a corporate perspective, we could say, oh, doom and gloom, privacy laws, it's being very restrictive. It's almost like saying a seatbelt is very restrictive. Actually, it's a good idea to wear a seatbelt. And so what they saw was, okay, GDPR is there. There will be new other local laws as well, whether it be CCPA or e-privacy in Europe, or as Julia said, the laws in Brazil and India, wherever. The thing is, we need to recognize that these laws are going to be more extensive as we move forward. They are not going to go away anytime soon. So they're looking for the legal guidance. They looked at the company risk profile. They did all this, and they certainly invested in money. What I think is also important is that they looked at the positive side. They thought about the company brand. What does it mean for us to show that we are, as Deniz was saying at the beginning, we are trusted. You can trust us with your data. They were able to use this whole exercise and process improvement to gain better analytics for their data. And they started to say, it's not about how many emails I send or how many opens I get. What genuine interactions am I having with my prospects and with my customers? So it's all about being good and honest and gaining that loyalty and a reputation for being a trustworthy company with their data. That's what they did. Also, I think it's important to think about that they recognized that just data is about a process. Data is not a job that you do every time you recognize that your data is no good. It's about what processes are you going through to improve a compliant contact acquisition process. So they were able to drive a better process, and they recognized the more compliant data, the more valid and relevant that data is, therefore the more accurate our campaigns can be as well. Did they lose data when they went to GDPR? Yes, they did. But they soon found out they're actually gaining more data now than they did even before GDPR. And it's all compliant as well. Think also about the way sales are getting involved. Someone's asking the question about the business cards. Is a business card personal data? Well, actually, it contains personal data. It does, absolutely. But if I give you my personal data at a trade show and say, please contact me, please give me information about your solutions, absolutely, you can do that. Of course you can. But I'm not saying, here's my business card, please spam me for the next 10 years, for example. The important thing is to recognize if there's a relationship and you have a lawful basis for communication, use what 3M did and said, okay, in that intervening period, maybe marketing should get involved and then send out those mails saying, hey, please, we'd like to engage with you, sign up for our newsletter, let's build a relationship, for example. So they're combining sales and marketing into a more aligned process to get better information and more a relationship with that prospect. So they've, as I say, they've had the technology involved with whenever a new contact was put into the Salesforce automation system, then an email would go from their MAP system to say, hey, we'd like you to sign up as well for our newsletter. But they did more than that. They also looked at the way they're using data. Now, again, we are here together on a webinar today, right now. And so, of course, transactional mails to remind the webinar can always be sent. But if you signed up for a webinar or even a series of webinars, 3M said, you know what? We're going to let people also know about our newsletters and about information. And we want them to really, in this case, consider and opt into our receiving our marketing information. So they used a standardized process for running, in this case, a classic tactic, the webinar, to make sure that it was consistent across the globe, to make sure that actually that the rules and regulations were being followed. But this drove consistency and standardization across all their activities. So, great. So that was what they did on the usage. They also looked at measurement. They began to train their sales force on BI tools to make sure that they could see what data was compliant. They were able to measure now the health of their database. Just having X million records in your database isn't useful. It's how good, how competent, how valid are those records, and what's the outreach effect of those records. Think also about them measuring compliance. So should anybody ever from the authorities come knocking on their door, no problem. We've got this all to hand. We have this documented. And so they are showing demonstrable proof of the way they are treating people's personal data. They were able to drive better performance because they had more understanding of the type of records or fields filled in their contact records, the more valuable those records were. And they could also look, in this particular case, especially for the EU, they could look at their opt-in rates per initiative, again, to see which campaigns, which tactics, which initiatives were giving them the best results. So if I look at some of the actual successes here, first of all, from a strategic position, they actually now have a viable and valid contact acquisition process. They didn't have it before. It was very ad hoc. They recognized that they need to go to a solid process. So they overhauled the entire process. They updated their corporate policies and made sure that every single region, every single business unit was adopting these policies. As I mentioned, they actually witnessed an improvement in their compliant contact acquisition, up by 145% from before when they started. They found that the preference data they were getting, they expended effort into building out a preference center, making sure that that data is actually more reliable and useful than some of their Salesforce automation information. They basically were able, in this particular case, to gain consent before passing information to the partner, so they had a good process in place to be able to pass that consent on. And yes, like the New Relic example before, they too looked at the financial implications of how they collected and stored data. And they found that they had 11 instances of their MAP system with some 7 contracts in place, 11 contracts with 7 emails instances. And they said, this is crazy business. Now, again, the law didn't say you can't do it. It's just that they found that this law proved a catalyst to drive better business. They were also now having a transparent view of their contact data across Europe. They were able to start measuring by open rates, etc. And they could then drive an improvement in deciding and defining what the campaign requirements were as well. So if I sound positive about the privacy laws, it's not to say that I'm underestimating the additional work. I'm not underestimating some of the frustration sometimes. But the same way we go about campaign planning and territory planning, it's all a bit of a pain, isn't it? No, actually, it's a good idea. It makes solid business sense, as does compliance with the data privacy regulations. What these laws are about is saying, are you being professional and good marketers and salespeople? Are you being relevant and focused with your data? And are you treating the people's personal data with respect? So I hope that's given you a good understanding of two examples. And with that, I'd like to pass you back to Deniz.
Thank you, Julian. Great real-life examples and really a comprehensive framework for tackling the issue. I wanted to share just a couple of pieces of tactical advice for those on the line that may be in a demand gen role or a marketing ops role. So if you're in demand gen, an easy way to get started, obviously, is to start thinking about a couple of areas, right? So firstly, you'll want to work closely with your legal team to make sure that you update your privacy policy and cookie banner. So for those of you that are in the 20% range that are planning to be compliant this year, that's a good way to get started. Obviously, your digital storefront and your website communicates a lot about your image in the market. So I would start there. If you don't have a legal team, make sure you work with an outside professional for some consulting here so that you're covered across all of your bases. Second, if you're buying third-party email lists, make sure you're vetting your sources. Do you have a preference center set up to maintain suppressions and opt-outs? These are some of the questions you should be asking. If you're doing any paid media or working with an agency, make sure you're vetting those sources that they're using to run campaigns for you. Compliance really needs to be part of your due diligence. As Julia mentioned earlier, right, there's a vendor requirement under CCPA. So if your vendors are not compliant or using questionable tactics, it could have downstream impacts on you as well. And if you have an event presence, make sure whoever has access or privileges to share lead files and FTP sites are reviewed. You saw that diagram that Julian shared on New Relic. They mapped their trade shows and event presences and made sure that whoever was handling data across all of those sources was educated and trained on how to handle that data with respect, right? And finally, if you're doing any direct mail, make sure you clean recipients against those internal opt-out lists if folks from California have requested to be removed from your list. So just some easy ways to get started. If you're in marketing ops, you'll want to assess your MarTech stack, right? You saw that example, again, of New Relic. They mapped all the inflows and outflows of data across their stack in a nice visual way. They reviewed the data inputs via their data supply chain. You know, the data intake component of the framework that Julian shared is an important piece of this, and established a process for auditing those servers and maintaining the quality and the compliance of that data. And these slides will be made available after, so I'm not going to go through each of the questions here. But you want to make a list of which systems house customer and prospect data, who has access rights to those, who's involved in sourcing data for campaigns, how are you vetting vendors you work with, and finally define a process for auditing those internal access systems such as marketing automation, which tends to be a primary engagement channel for most of us, right, sending emails. And you'll need to honor opt-out and information requests, right? So if someone wants to be removed or wants to learn more about how you got their data, be prepared to have a process defined for that and know where to go to get the data to honor those requests. And in today's omnichannel world, really simply removing someone from an email list may not be sufficient, right? There may be multiple channels and source systems for which user data may need to be removed for opt-out requests, right? And I believe this is where some technology can help. You can certainly do this through manual processes and working collaboratively with your various stakeholders, but the rise of customer data platforms, or CDPs, have emerged as a technology not only to help marketers consolidate their data and activate engagement strategies across all channels, but also consolidate all that data, all the different engagement channels and strategies in one single source of truth so that you can be better prepared for compliance and governance as well. Think of CDPs or customer data platforms as that central nervous system, right, that control panel that really determines how you're engaging your customers across sales channels, across email, across display, search, social, right? Everything originates here, so it's an easier way to track and manage those folks that have requested to be removed from your communications and honor those requests. And CDPs manage both first and third-party data, right? So wanted to make a key distinction here amongst both. First-party data is really data that you're organically collecting on your customers and prospects. So thus, it's a bit easier to track and control from a privacy perspective. You know where you got it from. You can really assign ownership and tracking to that. When you're working with third-party vendors, this can be a little bit more obscure, right, or a little bit less transparent, especially if you're working with some agencies. You need to make sure that you're putting this through your third-party vendor due diligence process and making sure that you're asking the question to them on how they're sourcing their data, because it can really have compliance issues and impact to you, right? While it can help you with the reach angle, right, it can give you a lot of reach, you can be sacrificing privacy on that front if you're not doing your due diligence. So one of the resources that we'll be giving all of you today by the end of the webinar is some questions that you should be asking your contact data or third-party data vendors, right? This is an example of what 3M did that Julian was referring to, right? They vetted their contact acquisition strategy. They had 145% increase in compliance that they had across the vendors that they were working with. Similarly, we advise all of you to take on this task and ask a couple of questions when you're onboarding new vendors and maybe revisit some of the vendors that you're working with here today. And we'll be sharing this resource with all of you at the end of the webinar. So with that, I wanted to leave some time for Q&A. We've been getting some great questions from you all throughout the presentation. So I'll transfer it over to Maggie to run us through some of the questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Big thanks to Deniz, Julia, and Julian for all the information. All right. So we have a couple. The first one I'll get started with is going to be for Julian Archer, and it is business card info considered personal data? And then we also had another question specifically about phone numbers.
The phone number. If it's, GDPR specifics actually sort of says, if the information is directly or indirectly to somebody, an individual, then it's obviously covered by, in this case, GDPR. The point there is, of course, a telephone number. If it's a mobile number, I'm the only person with that mobile number. If you wanted to call via the switchboard of an organization, then that's not personal because obviously that relates to an account. So on a business card, there'll be information that relates to the account, but it's more likely that you're talking about the name and the email and the personal phone number, in which case that is personal data. I think it's really important to consider the use you're going to put to that data, how you obtain that data, the source of that data, what consent did you gain when you actually got that business card. For example, in Europe as an example, if you have a fishbowl at a trade show and says, hey, win an iPad or something, and somebody puts that business card in the fishbowl, that is not consent. But you may say, well, actually, your lawyers may let you say, well, it's a legitimate interest. And so your lawyers may let you say, I'm going to let you communicate with that person based on that. It really depends on what you intend to do with that data and how you process it. The same, so that, I think that covers both questions there.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. And I have a couple for Julia. So first one is, we are starting to get client contracts that have do not market to our employees clauses in them, which appears to be somehow linked to CCPA. How are companies handling this, especially when employees may have opted in previously? And are there any insights in the definition of marketing, quote unquote, as we often use our marketing automation system to update users about technology upgrades or user webinars?
So, and I think it is related to the CCPA from the perspective of it kind of puts privacy at the forefront of everyone's mind. But, you know, other than that, that language doesn't sound like the exercise of a CCPA right to me, because CCPA rights are really something that is exercised by the individual, whereas what is being described here is something that is being put into a contract. So I don't necessarily think that this is directly a CCPA issue. This is a contractual language issue, and I would say that you have to reach out to whoever's contract it is to get better clarity as to how they expect you to meet those obligations.
Okay, great. And then this seems to be a little bit similar, but I think it was from a different point of view. To what extent are employees covered by CCPA?
So that's a great question, and I think that, you know, when I spoke about the law going into effect, I spoke about it from a marketing perspective, and I don't want to get too deep down into employee issues, but at a very high level, and having said that you should really consult your in-house counsel for the details here, at a very high level, employee data requirements, the timing for it is a little different. So the privacy notice for your employees, that has to be in place from January 1st, 2020. And that means that you have an obligation to tell your employees, just like you have an obligation to tell everyone else, what type of data you are collecting on them. And I do encourage you to be transparent about that. It's just an requirement to give your employees that knowledge of the type of data being collected. On January 1st, 2021, which is in nearly a year, there is also going to be a requirement to give CCPA rights to employees. So those rights about the right to access, the right to know, delete, and opt out will be extended to employees as well.
Great, thank you. All right, and I think that we have time for just a few more. So one of them is, what is the best way to cleanse your data, especially emails, manual process, third-party vendor, or other? Dennis, can you help with this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the benefit of working with a third-party provider here is obviously the scale, right? Typically, being able to collect data from multiple areas, vet that data, make sure that it's clean, complete, and actionable, and empower you to make sure that your information matches that most current view of the client or the customer or the prospect, right? We all know that data decays really rapidly, so making sure that you're using a partner there that has that as a core competency, I think makes the best sense. There are obviously manual ways that you can do that as well, but it could be quite resource intensive. There's a lot of automation and tools that can be embedded directly in your CRM, for instance, to keep that data up to date for your sales teams and your operations teams. Make sure that the data that's going into your marketing automation platform through a lead form is clean and complete and actionable, and that you're making sure that those emails are deliverable, right? That they're not bouncing and affecting your send rates or your reputation scores. So I would advise working with a third-party vendor there because, again, they're going to have the scale. They're going to make sure that that data is vetted and is compliant, and it can help you as well make sure that your data is most current and actionable.
Great, thank you, Dennis. All right, another one that we had come in is, how do you see CCPA and other upcoming privacy regulations impacting web de-anonymization tactics? Is it a sustainable marketing activity, or will it become obsolete after regulations start to become enforced?
I can take that one, Maggie.
Can you help with that one too? Okay.
Yeah, I can even answer that one.
Yeah, I'll quickly answer. You can take it, Julian, after. But I mean, web de-anonymization really focuses on unmasking the company, so not really the individual. It should be protecting individual privacy. Be careful if, some folks are promising that they can unmask individual identity. That does violate internet privacy laws. Most organizations that help with this kind of technology, they'll hash the personally identifiable information and really mask any sensitive information about the individual, such as their name or email, right? And you can really still append any first-party data that you know about the account and make kind of educated guesses about who's browsing your site. So once you unmask that account, you can take a look at your ideal customer profile, say, hey, we're focusing on the marketing individual or the sales individual, and start to do some follow-up that way. We do see CCPA and similar regulations taking more of a center stage in B2B marketing heading into this year. So we really recommend that you work with vendors that take a privacy-first approach here in unmasking that identity on your website.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it's also important to say that some organizations, for example, they put improved cookie consent management solutions on their websites. The days of we use cookies, got it type of banners are really numbered. I think it's also to break it down into required functional and marketing cookies. We are looking at the European angle. We're looking at some point in the future, the e-privacy regulation will come in, but that's been delayed because, indeed, of this whole nebulous problem with such a big business of actually tracking people. But what Siemens do, they actually drop the last four digits of the cookie of the IP address, for example, and so then that remains then at an anonymous level, at an account level, as opposed to contact level. So there are many different types of solutions to make sure that you can remain compliant, but still use sensible tracking to help you with your marketing and sales.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, those are all the questions that we had for today. So again, I wanted to thank everyone for joining us, and a big shout out to our speakers, Julian from Forrester, we appreciate you coming on, and Deniz and Julia from the Dun Bradstreet team. So over the next few days, you will be getting an email with a copy of the presentation as well as the PDF for 5 questions to ask your contact data provider. So thank you again. Please feel free to reach out to the Dun Bradstreet team if you have individual questions, and we will talk to you soon. Have a great day.